away or something. Okay, nope, it's too late. Yeah. So welcome everybody to Orthodoxy 101. This is good. Tonight's lesson is going to be called Monasticism Part 2, and it's probably going to end up being Part 2 of 3, because as I started to sit down and write this, I just wanted to give you guys a comprehensive overview of what the history of monasticism was, how it sort of started in the early church, how it developed, and sort of where we are today. And then in doing that, I didn't really get past the 300-400s. So we're taking it slow, and because I kept just realizing, oh, well, in order to understand this, well, they have to know about this. Well, if they don't know about that, they need to really learn about this. So it just kind of things piled on top of each other. But I hope this will be edifying for all of you, and you can really understand the deep roots of what monasticism is. So monasticism. So monasticism, like we said, is the institution of living apart from the world as a monk or nun. A monk or a nun, in Greek or Russian, it's the same language as masculine versus feminine, but in English we have two separate words, is someone who has made certain vows to God to live in a certain way in order to perfect knowledge of God so that they can come to know God directly in the process of purification, illumination, deification. So what the monk or nun strives for is union with God, is conscious awareness and being with God in this life and in the next life. And they do it through a number of practices, but the most foundational practices are chastity. So they don't marry and they give up sexual relations of any kind. Poverty, they don't own barely anything. They own barely anything, and they strive to own as little as possible and still be functional. Stability, once they take their final vows, they are to die in the monastery of their repentance unless ordered to leave by the superior. And chastity and obedience, they have to live their life around the will of the superior, the abbot or abbess who leads the monastery, so that they can give up their own will and come to learn to do the will of God. And we said that monasticism has its roots even in the Old Testament times, and even in the life of New Testament figures such as Jesus Christ, who was ascetic and disciplined and went out into the wilderness for 40 days before beginning his public ministry. St. John the Baptist, who spent his entire life in solitude in the wilderness and lived a very austere lifestyle. And St. Paul, who after his conversion, but before he went out to minister to the churches of God, also spent about 12 or so years in the deserts of Arabia, sort of practicing spiritual discipline. So we said this has very deep roots in the scriptures themselves. But today we're going to talk about the history of monasticism, sort of what did it begin as and how did it develop and how did it sort of get to the situation we have now. Obviously, it wasn't in the time of Jesus Christ. There were people who lived monastic style lives, but it wasn't so formalized or institutionalized the way it is now. So we're going to talk about how it developed and why it developed the way it is, and sort of why it's a legitimate, if not one of the most legitimate ways of Orthodox Christian practice. So before we begin the sort of the timeline of monasticism, does anyone have any questions or clarifications they want to talk about? Hello, Elaine, welcome. Does anyone want to know any clarifications about sort of, the basics of monasticism? What is a monk or nun? Why do they do what they do before we get? No? Okay. So monasticism. We're going to start, and I decided I'm going to do something different. I'm just going to try to share my screen with you guys, so you don't have to worry about me copy pasting things out in the thing. So we're going to start with the Bible, where monasticism really has its first beginnings. Like I said, there were monastic-like institutions in the Old Testament where Elijah and Elisha had people called the sons of the prophets who surrounded them in the desert and who lived with them as sort of, spiritual masters. Can you guys see my screen? And you also had something called the Nazarite vow, where somebody would cut their hair and make a vow to God and during that time not drink alcohol, and other various figures, who practiced this sort of spiritual discipline in the wilderness. So there were precursors to monasticism all throughout the Bible. Yes.
Cut their hair or not cut their hair?
So they would cut it first, and then from that point on.
You weren't ever supposed to get your hair cut and drink any alcohol.
So you inaugurated the vow by getting your hair cut once, and from that point on, you did not cut it ever again. Yeah, it's a good question about the Nazarite vow. or you didn't cut your hair until the vow was completed. Oftentimes there's a time limit on it. But so now we're going to go into the New Testament. I already spoke about St. Paul. I talked about Jesus. I talked about John the Baptist. Again, this sort of ascetic, disciplined, chaste life is just, it's everywhere in the Bible. But now we're going into how the early Christians lived. And we're going to say that the first Christians lived a form of life that was ascetic, that is to say, relating to bodily discipline. That's what asceticism is. It's sort of bodily discipline for a spiritual person, for a spiritual purpose. So the first Christians lived a form of life that was ascetic and already quasi-monastic. So if you see our first quote from Acts 4, 32, 35, we see, now the multitude of those who believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of the things he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And with great power, the apostles gave witness to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Nor was there anyone among them who lacked, for all who were possessors of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold and laid them at the apostles' feet. And they distributed to each one who has need. So the first Christians lived with all things in common. They shared all their possessions, and they didn't count anything as their own. But this is already the beginnings of a vow of poverty, or if not, already an almost full-fledged vow of poverty. The vow to not own anything, and what resources you do have to distribute for the good of all. In fact, in Acts chapter 5, there's a story that some people don't like, but it's about how some of the early Christians named Ananias and Sapphira withheld they sold all their property and gave it to the poor, but they withheld a little bit of themselves for themselves. And when they go before St. Peter and they tell him, "Oh, we sold everything," and Peter says something to the effect of, "Okay, you really sold everything?" They say, "Yeah," and then they just drop dead, basically, because they lied before the Holy Spirit. So not only were these early Christians holding all the things in their common, but it was very severe not to hold all your things in common. You would die. And presumably, your eternal fate is not good. I mean, we don't speculate too deeply about that, but we also look at other practices of the early Christians. So this is from the Council of Jerusalem. Acts chapter 15, verse 29. You were to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. So even though they weren't living 100% celibate lives, they could be, have a lawful husband or a lawful wife. Their sexual behavior was strictly limited to just that, and they did not eat meat offered to idols, which in the ancient days actually meant they were more or less not eating meat, because most of the meat, unless you were growing it yourself, most of what you could acquire on the meat market would have been offered to an idol, or would have been part of the sacrifice. So again, there is this kind of thing in Christianity where meat eating is allowed. I eat meat myself, but it's looked at a little weird because they didn't eat meat in paradise, and monks and nuns don't eat, and God didn't actually allow for human beings to eat meat until after Noah's flood. So there's this kind of sense in the Bible and in Christianity that eating meat is part of the degeneration of the world, that it's not necessarily how human beings in their most perfect state are meant to eat. Again, meat is not a sin. Eating meat is not a sin, but the Christian ideal leans more towards vegetarianism than towards carnivory.
When God was talking to Noah, he made it clear. He says, "Okay, now I'm giving you permission, to eat meat, but make sure you get all the blood out of it.
Yeah,
and because I'm allowing you to do this, now all the animals will be afraid of you, whereas before they were not." That's really weird, but that's I think it's in the 5th chapter, or maybe the 6th chapter.
So I think the flood ends in chapter 10.
When God is talking to Moses. Maybe it's later.
We'll have to go back and review. We'll do creation at some point, because these are important things that I can't remember the details of, so I can't.
But because of that, there was tradition passed on that in the ideal creation, human beings did not eat other creatures.
Right.
And it was only after the fall that God allowed them to do so on a limited basis, as long as they gave the blood, which was the life, and the life belonged to God. So you had to give that back.
Right, and it's still very, very important for kosher
Yeah,
to extract as
Yeah.
fully as possible blood from an animal. And really, we Christians, I mean, the New Testament was never really abrogated. This command against eating blood. We shouldn't be eating blood. I don't know that anyone does eat blood in any butcher shop that I know of. The blood's going to be drained. Sometimes the red liquid you see isn't necessarily blood and meat. But anyway, eating blood is bad. And so then we go on for 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 8 through 9. This is St. Paul speaking to the Corinthians. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So St. Paul here is very clearly laying out that it's better to be celibate if you're going to be living a Christian life. It's higher. It's the more ideal form. Again, I'm saying that as a married man, most Christians are married, and that's fine, and that's blessed by God. It's not a sin to be married. But there is this sense, even from the first days of Christianity, that the highest way of life is this chaste way of life, because you're living the way of life of the angels, and you're not participating in sort of the fallenness of this world. So, and then finally, we have this. In addition to living sort of an ascetic life where they were very disciplined in various bodily ways, they were restraining their appetites, and especially not really eating that much meat. They were restraining their sexual appetites. They were holding their property in common. The early Christians also endured serious deprivation, persecution, and frequently martyrdom. So what you have here is St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verses 23 to 29. He's talking about his own, what he sort of has happened to him being a minister of the gospel, preaching Christ. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure. When he talks about stripes, he's talking about lashes on his back. In prisons more frequently, in deaths often. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've been in the deep. In journeys often, in perils of waters, in perils of robbers, in perils of mine own countrymen, in perils of the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, in weariness and toil, in sleeplessness often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I do not burn with indignation? So this, of course, Paul is a little bit exceptional because he was a missionary and traveled around to all the churches. But in general, what he's talking about, being beaten, being lashed, being put into prison, these were things that happened to all Christians, because Christians, by their creed, refused to participate in the idol worship of the Roman Empire. By the way, that's what Christians, I think I maybe have underlined this before, but that's what Christians were punished for. They didn't care. The Romans didn't care if you prayed to Jesus. They only wanted you to also pray to Jupiter and Mars and so on. And the genius of the emperor, that was key. You had to pray to the emperor's like spirit, called his genius, and you had it sort of almost treating the emperor like a living god, and then after his death, treating him as a full-on god. And Christians utterly refused to worship a living man or worship idols made by hands. So that's what Christians were brutally persecuted for. They wouldn't acknowledge any god but the Holy Trinity, and they were persecuted quite severely, quite viciously, because they were seen as antisocial and sort of a threat to the stability of the realm. There was kind of this way that the Roman Empire, even though Rome conquered so many different peoples and cultures and tribes and languages, they were able to sort of assimilate everyone by saying, okay, as long as you participate in our religious practices, that shows you're a good citizen, that shows you're on board, that shows you're willing to participate in the government. And Christians were very zealous about obeying the law. Actually, it comes up again and again in early Christian writings that they obeyed the legitimate authorities. They didn't break the law. They didn't commit any crimes, but the one thing they wouldn't do is they wouldn't participate in the religious system. And that was what caused them so much suffering. But so the early Christians lived with tremendous discipline, enduring serious deprivation, persecution, and frequently martyrdom. And so this is what characterized the early Christians. It was in a radical way of life and a difficult way of life. But through this, however, they experienced great blessings and grace from God. So in spite of everything they suffered, or rather, in fact, because of everything they suffered, the church grew and actually somewhat exponentially. So Tertullian, who's not a saint but is kind of counted among the fathers of the church, said the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the church. It was precisely because Christians could be seen very publicly to live this lifestyle and receive great benefit from it, that the popularity and the fame of Christianity sort of spread surprisingly rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. I mean, like we know with the apostles, is within a generation of Jesus's death, you have Christians popping up as far away as Italy, France, and Spain. I mean, that's rapid for the ancient world. That is, considering, any kind of communication travels very, very slowly, let alone actually a movement where you need followers and establishment. So it is remarkable, and it was the witness of the martyrs that contributed heavily to that. So I thought for our first, now we're talking about monasticism today, but monasticism is I'm going to try to explain later, is actually just in many ways it's an attempt to recapture sort of the life of the early Christians after Christianity became legalized. So it's going to seem like a bit of a digression, but in order to sort of underscore that point, so you have a taste of what the early Christians were like, we're going to read from two accounts of the early Christians to really see what they were all about, so that we can then go on and see, okay, how monasticism was a continuation of this. So the first thing we're going to read is from St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Romans. Now, St. Ignatius of Antioch was one of these really remarkable figures and sort of larger than life, who had this big impact in spreading Christianity. Now, what's interesting about St. Ignatius of Antioch was he was a bishop in Antioch, the head priest in one of the major Roman cities. So the three major Roman cities at this time were Rome, Alexandria, Egypt, and then Antioch. These were the three big population centers. So to say he was the bishop of Antioch meant he was someone significant. He had this big population base, and he was a hearer of John the Apostle. So he was within the first generation of the apostles. St. Ignatius of Antioch was a disciple of St. John the Apostle and Evangelist, and ostensibly, also maybe had interactions with the other apostles, but he was really a disciple of John the Evangelist. So that's why we call him and others from his generation the apostolic fathers. So they didn't see Jesus themselves, but they saw the people who saw Jesus and learned from them directly. And there's, obviously something very remarkable in that. So what's cool about St. Ignatius is he's being imprisoned for, being a Christian, for refusing to participate in the pagan rites. And he's being taken to Rome under guard. They're going to make, because he's an important Christian, they're going to make a spectacle out of him by feeding him to wild beasts in the arena. So he's going to be torn apart and mauled to death. So while he's traveling from Antioch, now, I don't know how many of you can picture a map super great in our heads, but I don't have a map for you. So Antioch is in what's now between Turkey and Syria. So we're talking the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And St. Ignatius is being taken under a guard of soldiers all the way to Rome. So he's passing all the way through what's now Turkey, Greece, up past maybe Croatia, and then into Rome, Italy. So it's a long journey. And this whole time, he's writing these letters on his journey to Rome, telling the Christians, don't try to rescue me. I want to be martyred. This is for the glory of God. And so we still have his letters today, and they're really remarkable. So that's what we're gonna read about. So this is an excerpt from St. Ignatius's letter to the Romans. So he's trying to tell the Romans, when he gets there, don't try to save me, okay? I am writing to all the churches to declare to them that I am glad to die for God, if you only do not hinder me. I beg you not to show me a misplaced kindness. Allow me to be the food of wild beasts, that I may come to God. I am God's wheat, and I shall be ground by the teeth of wild beasts, so that I may become Christ's pure bread. I would prefer that you goad the beasts to become my tomb, and leave no scrap of me behind. Wow. Then once I have fallen asleep, I do not wish to be a burden to anyone. I shall be a true disciple of Christ when the world no longer sees my body. Pray to Christ for me, so that by these means I may become a sacrifice to God. I do not give you orders like Peter and Paul. They were apostles. I am a condemned criminal. So even he's not just putting on a show, but he has this humility. They were free. I am still a slave. But if I suffer, I shall become a freed man of Jesus Christ, and I shall arise again to freedom in him. Now, as a prisoner, I am learning to give up my own wishes. See, this is monasticism in a sense. This is obedience. This is the ideal of obedience. All the way from Syria to Rome, I am fighting with wild beasts by the land and by the sea. By day and by night, chained as I am to 10 leopards. I mean, the detachment of soldiers who guard me. So I think the Roman soldiers would have these animal pipe stylings about them. The better you treat them, the worse they become. Because of their cruelty, I am more and more learning to become a true disciple. But not by this am I justified. So he's saying, this is this ideal of what Jesus Christ himself did, turning the other cheek. They're beating him, they're torturing him, they're mistreating him, and dragging him behind them to his death. How happy I will be with the beasts which are prepared for me. I hope that they will make short work of me. I shall even coax them to devour me quickly, and not to be afraid of touching me, as sometimes happens. In fact, if they hold back, I shall force them to eat. Bear with me, for I know what is good for me. Now I am beginning to be a disciple. May nothing visible or invisible rob me of my price, which is Jesus Christ. The fire, the cross, packs of wild beasts, lacerations, rendings, wrenching of bones, mangling of limbs, crushing of the whole body, and horrible tortures of the devil, come what may, if only I may gain Jesus Christ. Wow. I mean, this gives me chills. Because why? Because this happened to him.
Yeah.
He got to Rome and no one saved him, and he got mauled to death. And the sort of heroic nobility of spirit and devotion of the early Christians, it's really far beyond, like if you just think of modern day Christianity, even in your average Orthodox parish, it's so many leaps and bounds beyond what we're used to that you can really understand why so many people were attracted to the nobility and power in this attitude and the certainty he had going to face his vicious death. So
that is true, but you also do need to remember from the record there were many who figured out.
Yeah,
that's what makes these people so remarkable.
Right. And that's a good point. Many people who adopted Christianity, maybe a larger proportion than the ones who were martyred, quit, gave up. They gave in and they sacrificed to the Roman deities. And that kind of highlights first of all, those people's names, we don't remember them. And second, it sort of highlights the heroism of the early Christians. They did have a legitimate choice. He could have gotten it out of it at any point. How do we know that? Because other people did take that way out. Mm-hmm. And he chose not to, but he chose to give 100%. So you can already, just by reading these, you get a fuller sense of what sort of Christians the early Christians were like. The sort of austerity, the sort of self-discipline, the sort of total, not in the negative sense, but fanatical sort of devotion.
There was a Roman, I guess you would call him governor of a province in a place called Bithynia, which is in the northern part of Turkey. And he wrote to his friend who was the emperor, and he said, yeah, they've brought people to me who have been accused of Christianity, and I'll ask them flat out, are you a Christian? And if they say no, I'll let them go.
Yeah.
And if they bring them back, I'll ask them that again. And if they and I'll tell them, I said, if you say that you are, I will beat you. And if I ever see you again, I'll put you to death. And he said, then if I saw him again, then I would put him to death. And he said, he wrote to the Emperor Trajan, and he said, did I do the right thing? And Trajan said, yeah, you did a good job.
Yeah. So yeah, it almost, I mean, by a worldly sense, the Christians are the unreasonable ones, right? They could, just offer the incense to the emperor. It's that simple. You don't have to believe it. We don't care. If you accept Julius Caesar into your heart, we don't care. Just go through the motions, and we'll let you be. But because of their integrity and because of their devotion, they could not accept that, and it is really remarkable. Because they utterly shunned the things of this world, which again is a theme that comes up in the monasticism. And so I'll take you through another early Christian document, which is from the same sort of era as St. Ignatius, which is the martyrdom of Polycarp. St. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, another bishop, again, to be, made a public example of by torture and execution. I think he was the bishop of Smyrna, like I said, and he also was a hearer of St. John the Evangelist. Yeah. So he was from this first generation of apostolic fathers, the people who saw Jesus. And so we'll read about the martyrdom of Polycarp, and this is recorded by his eyewitnesses. So it's a contemporaneous document. It's not, sometimes you have later legends of saints that crop up 200, 300, 400 years later. And so it's like, okay, you're not 100% sure what relation this bears to the actual events. But this martyrdom of Polycarp is very, very early. So here I edited these texts heavily, not in terms of changing what's in them, but in terms of just cutting things out, just so if we read these whole things, we'd be here all night. So I feel bad. I had to make some arbitrary choices because it feels like everything's important. I want to read you guys everything, but I'm trying to keep this to a tight hour. So, okay. On Friday about the supper hour, the police and horsemen went forth with their accustomed weapons, hurrying as against a robber. And coming up in a troop late in the evening, they found the man himself, Polycarp, in bed in an upper chamber in a certain cottage, and though he might have departed there to another place, he would not, saying, "The will of God be done." So he has a chance to escape, and he doesn't take it. So when he heard that they were come, that is to say, the Roman soldiers, he went down and conversed with them, the bystanders marveling at his age and his constancy, and wondering why there should be so much eagerness for the apprehension of an old man like him. At that, he immediately gave orders that a table should be spread for them to eat and drink at that hour, as much as they desired. So he's serving the people who are coming to arrest him. And he persuaded them to grant him an hour so that he might pray unmolested. And on their consenting, he stood up and prayed, being so full of grace of God that for 2 hours he could not hold his peace. And those that heard were amazed, and many repented that they had come against such a venerable old man. But when at length he brought his prayer to an end, after remembering all who at any time had come in his way, small and great, high and low, in the universal church throughout the world, the hour of his departure being come, they seated him on a donkey and brought him into the city, it being a high Sabbath. But as Polycarp entered into the stadium, so this is obviously now, they've brought him to the stadium to be executed, and he's going to be questioned by the governor. But as Polycarp entered into the stadium, a voice came to him from heaven, "Be strong, Polycarp, and be a man." And no one saw the speaker, but those of our people who were present heard the voice. And at length, when he was brought up, there was a great tumult, for they heard Polycarp had been apprehended. When then he was brought before him, the proconsul asked whether he were the man. And on his confessing that he was, he tried to persuade him to a denial, saying, "Have respect to your age." See, like Tom said, the governor's trying to give him an out. Just said, look, just do it. Just offer incense to the emperor, and that'll be that. And other things in accordance therewith, as it is their habit to say, "Swear by the genius of Caesar, repent and say, away with the atheists." So that's a peculiar thing, but Christians were called atheists because they rejected the gods. Then Polycarp with solemn countenance looked upon the whole multitude of lawless heathen that were in the stadium and waved his hand to them, and groaning and looking up to heaven, he said, "Away with the atheists." So he's turning sort of their insult on them. But when the magistrate pressed him hard and said, "Swear the oath and I will release you, revile the Christ," Polycarp says, 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? And then I cut out some text, some more dialogue, and now we get to the part where, his execution comes. Then they sought fit to shout out with one accord that Polycarp should be burned alive. These things then happened with so great speed, quicker than words could tell. The crowds immediately collected timber and sticks from the workshops and baths, and the Jews more especially assisted in this with zeal, as is their custom. But when the pile was made ready, divesting himself of all his upper garments and loosing his belt, he endeavored also to take off his shoes, though not in the habit of doing this before, because all the faithful at times vied eagerly who should be soonest to touch his flesh. For he had been treated with all honor for his holy life, even before his gray hairs came. Immediately then the instruments that were prepared for the pile were placed about him, as they were going likewise to nail him to the stake. So they were going to nail him down, basically, so he can't run from the fire and catch everything else on fire. He said, "Leave me as I am, for he that has granted me to endure the fire will grant me also to remain at the pyre unmoved, even without the security which you seek from the nails." So they did not nail him, but tied him. Then he, placing his hands behind him and being bound to the stake, like a noble ram out of a great flock for an offering, a burnt sacrifice made ready and acceptable to God, looking up to heaven, said, "O Lord God Almighty, the Father of your beloved and blessed Son, Jesus Christ, through whom we have received the knowledge of you, the God of angels and powers and of all creation, and of the whole race of the righteous who live in your presence, I bless you because you have granted me this day and hour, that I might receive a portion amongst the number of martyrs in the cup of your Christ unto resurrection of eternal life, both of soul and body, in the incorruptibility of the Holy Spirit. May I be received among these in your presence this day, as a rich and acceptable sacrifice, as you did prepare and reveal it beforehand, and have accomplished it. You that art the faithful and true God. For this cause, yea, and for all things, I praise you, I bless you, I glorify you, through the eternal and heavenly high priest, Jesus Christ, your beloved Son, through whom, with him and the Holy Spirit, be glory both now and ever, and to the ages to come. Amen. So even at the moment of his execution, he's glorifying God for the opportunity to be executed. Really remarkable strength of character. And when he had finished up the amen, and when he had offered up the amen and finished his prayer, the firemen lighted the fire. And a mighty flame flashing forth, we to whom it was given to see. So again, there's an eyewitness account. They're dropping that a couple times. Saw a marvel, yea, and we were preserved that we might relate to the rest what happened. The fire, making the appearance of a vault, like the sail of a vessel filled by the wind, made a wall round about the body of the martyr, and there it was in the midst, not like flesh burning, but like a loaf in the oven, or gold and silver refined in the furnace. So while he's trying to burn him alive, it's not even actually touching his body. For we perceive such a fragrant smell as if it were the wafted odor of frankincense or some other precious spice. So the fragrance of sanctity often accompanies the saints, even in the modern day. But this, it's a special way because it's almost like he's an incense offering to God. So at length the lawless men, seeing that his body could not be consumed by the fire, ordered an executioner to go up and to stab him with a dagger. And when he had done this, there came forth a dove and a quantity of blood, so that it extinguished the fire. And all the multitude marveled that there should be so great a difference between the unbelievers and the elect. In the number of these latter was this man, the glorious martyr Polycarp, who is found in an apostolic and prophetic teacher in our time, a bishop of the Holy Church which is in Smyrna. For every word which he uttered from his mouth was accomplished and will be accomplished. So again, there's the heroism of his witness and his fearlessness in the face of these terrible afflictions, and his unflinching commitment to Christ, not to mention these great manifestations of grace, these miracles, which certainly had some impression on the people who were watching. Even if even if you see something strange, you can always deny it, you can always twist it in your mind, but clearly for those who were able to accept it, it was something remarkable. And you can see why this was so attractive, and why this helped the Christian faith spread, and why it was sort of the glory of the Christians were the martyrs. Any questions so far? These are the early Christians and their martyrdoms that we're talking about. So what I'm trying to say is the Christians experience great hardship, but it's not like they got nothing out of it. And that's an important theme for monasticism too. It's like, okay, why do you eat so little? Why do you stay up so late? Why have these long prayers? Well, because the connection with God is actually real and manifests itself, especially to the believer, but even in some ways to those around them as well. They're doing this because they're getting something out of it, because there's actual grace to be found in this way of life. It's why they're not just like sad and miserable all the time, but overflowing with this joy. Okay, so I'll stop presenting just for a moment. So that was what the early Christians were all about. They were incredibly disciplined, they were incredibly devoted, and they had this remarkable way of life which attracted a number of people. That's for the first 300 years of Christianity. Again, Christianity mainly spreading, not exclusively, actually, it was spreading, in the Arab Peninsula, to the Ethiopian lands, to the Persian world to a certain degree. But especially what we know about is what was happening in the Roman Empire, where it really spread like wildfire and took hold. So the first Christians, they lived an austere and quasi-monastic life already. They were already all about self-denial. They were already about total devotion. But something changed. And what changed was that around the end of the 3rd century, so as Christianity becomes more and more popular, vicious persecution still happens, but it becomes more socially acceptable to be a Christian. And they're probably less marginalized and less hated, because now for generations people have lived around Christians and gotten used to them. And especially after the year 313, when Constantine legalizes Christianity. He doesn't establish it, even though he was a Christian, he doesn't establish it as the state religion just yet, but he legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan in 313. Then it's because he's a Christian, and because it's okay to be a Christian, you have this bigger, even though Christianity was growing really fast, you have this big influx of new believers into the churches. Christianity becomes the thing to do. And it becomes very popular. And throughout all of this, the experience of the church got diluted. It became worldly. you had people who were coming into Christianity for all sorts of reasons, with all sorts of attitudes, and often not for the right reasons. So the experience of the early Christians, that extreme level of morality, that extreme level of devotion, became very watered down very quickly. This is in the early 300s, and a lot of what became the early monastic movement was reacting against that. Many Christians who had some inkling, either because it was passed down to them or because they remembered it because they were there, of what the earlier Christians were like, were disgusted sort of by what the church had become in some places and sometimes, or at least they were disappointed by, if not full on disgusted, they were disappointed by the departure of grace and the departure of this way of life. So some of them basically went off to live on their own, so that they could devote themselves to God as fully as they had in those early Christian centuries. So that's what I'm trying to explain, is that the big monastic movement, it was not something new. It was not trying to build a fundamentally new institution in Christianity, but it was trying to recapture what had been there from the very beginning, this life of total devotion and self-denial. So instead of being an innovation, monasticism is actually authentic Christianity reasserting itself in sort of a new form. So these people, they literally just went off into the wilderness, lived solitary lives. There was no game plan necessarily. At the beginning, they were called monks, which, it's from the Greek monarchy, which means just solitary people. They're called hermits, eremites, which again is all Greek. Desert dwellers, people who dwell in the desert, is eremos is Greek for desert, or anachorites, anchorites, which is those who depart. If you go to a Greek airport, you'll see anachorises, anchorite. Nope, it's departures. So. Because they separated themselves from society and lived alone or in small groups, so they were just, again, they were just seeing, okay, how can we live as authentically and as fully for Christ as possible? They lived alone or in small groups, struggling ruthlessly to practice the commandments of God. Like I said in the previous class, a lot of what motivates the monk is just to be able to do exactly what Jesus says. Okay, if someone robs you blind, you give them everything you have, and you try to give them even more. If someone hits you on your one cheek, get up, turn them your other cheek, and let them hit you again. This kind of real radical self-denial was much more possible if you don't have a family or a business or a livelihood. But if you're living this sort of ascetic, sparse life by yourself, it's much easier to practice these commandments of Jesus. So that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to perfect the virtues by fulfilling the commands of Jesus. Yes.
Yeah, I hear that, and then I remember reading Jesus often made statements that were really extreme.
Yeah.
And especially extreme in their own context.
Yeah.
Like don't go bury your father, let the dead bury their own dead. And that would be unthinkable in that culture.
Yeah.
You would never leave your father's corpse.
Yeah.
That would be absolutely hideous. And some of this is there as a hyperbole.
Yeah.
In order that, so that you will see the shocking possibilities of the life that Jesus is calling you to. He wouldn't expect you to actually do that, but to be less concerned about your immediate intimates and more concerned about your relationship with God.
Yeah, you're right. Jesus doesn't want everyone to do everything he said literally. That's true. But a lot of people did take him literally and found great grace because of it. And some of them, took him literally and did stupid things. And it was cutting off their limbs or something. But so we shouldn't be so quick to say, well, Jesus didn't mean it literally. Well, he some people did take it literally and he blessed them. So it's a discernment process, what's right for us and how's he calling us as individuals to live. So certainly it's not normative. I myself have not sold everything I have and given to the poor. But for those who it's called, he means it literally.
Yeah, St. Francis took it literally,
Oh yeah, that's a different case, but yeah. But yeah, Saint Anthony definitely did. So they want to devote their lives fully to the commandments, and also there's an interesting twist to them going out to the desert, which was that the desert was regarded as the place where demons dwell. Remember, as Jesus went into the desert to be tempted by Satan, to do battle with Satan, basically. So in a lot of them, and this will come up in what we're going to read, saw themselves as doing battle with the devil. They said, we're going to go to his turf and we're going to take the fight to him. This way of life, the monastic life first flourished in the deserts of Egypt, and then spread to the Holy Land, and then but it quickly spread to all parts of the Christian world, especially after the publication of the Life of Anthony. So it's associated with like the literal desert, like we're talking sand and heat. But the way of life of the desert, went as far afield as France, and then eventually Russia, and there's not a literal desert there, but there's wilderness. But it's often referred to as the desert, regardless of whether or not there's a lot of rainfall there. So monastics sought to attain bloodless, anemacty in Greek, martyrdom, once the path of bloody martyrdom was closed. So thus, monasticism was not the invention of something new, but it was an attempt to recapture the life of the early church. The life of the early fathers of the desert was and that's what the first generation of those who went out in the desert were called, the fathers of the desert. There were women among them too, mothers of the desert, but I suppose more men, so they've become known as the fathers of the desert. So the life of the early fathers of the desert was characterized by the exact same things that characterized the lives of the early Christians, namely great struggle and suffering, accompanied by great grace and manifestations of God. So they got, the two sort of poles there. And monasticism began as an organic grassroots movement, and hence it has no particular founder. Again, this is something organic to Christianity. It's not. It became an institution, a formalized sort of practice, but it was very, very organic to the way of life Christians lived. And so it doesn't have one founder, and it doesn't have a founding date. However, several individuals stand out in their contributions to the development of monasticism as a central institution of the Christian world. So the first one we're going to talk about, and we're going to read some lengthy excerpts from his life. I'm going to try to do all this in 15 minutes because I want to keep this to a tight hour. But St. Anthony the Great, while he was not the first monk, is sometimes known as the father of monks because of how much his popularity set fire to the whole world through the life of Anthony by St. Athanasius. So St. Anthony was one of these individuals who heard the gospel, sell all you have, give to the poor. And he did that, and he went out into the desert, and he found great grace there by his really powerful spiritual struggle. And he had a disciple who later became the Bishop of Alexandria, named Saint Athanasius. And Saint Anthony was also famous. They were involved with the Arian controversy with condemning the heresy of Arius. But even more significantly, not long after Anthony's death, Saint Athanasius wrote down his whole life and published it and spread it around. And it caught the Christian world by storm. It exploded. Like he was like a rock star for the time and place. And he was already kind of famous in his life. St. Anthony was, for various reasons, but his fame spread far beyond Egypt. So within a generation of St. Anthony dying, you have monasteries, like full-on communities popping up as far away as France. So for the ancient Mediterranean world, that's really fast. Again, on par with growth of the early Christians. So let's take a look at the life of St. Anthony by St. Athanasius, so we can see sort of what was so inspiring. Again, I just wanted to read multiple chapters of this, and I ended up trimming it down a good bit. I hate that I trimmed some things down, but just for the purposes of time. So we're literally just going to read, some chopped up excerpts of the life of St. Anthony. So the part where I'm beginning it, he's already been to church. He was raised by Christian parents, was orphaned as a teenager. He hears Jesus say in the gospel, go sell all you have, give to the poor, and come follow me. And he says, okay, I'm going to do that. So he entrusts his sisters to the care of some women and just sells all he has, gives to the poor, and he goes to live in the desert. And now this is an account of how he began to live his life in the desert. So remember, he's not the first monk. Thus conducting himself, Antony was beloved by all. He subjected himself in sincerity to the good men whom he visited, and learned thoroughly where each surpassed him in zeal and discipline. He observed the graciousness of one, the unceasing prayer of another. He took knowledge of another's freedom from anger, and another's loving kindness. He gave heed to one as he watched, and to another as he studied. One he admired for his endurance, another for his fasting and sleeping on the ground. The meekness of one and long suffering of another he watched with care, while he took note of the piety towards Christ and the mutual love which animated all. Thus filled, he returned to his own place of discipline, and henceforth would strive to unite the qualities of each, and was eager to show himself the virtues of all. So St. Anthony, he's going to these sort of monastics or these proto-monastics and just observing their way of life. And you think this is really remarkable. I mean, you know, in the modern day, you can think of, okay, going to learn a skill from somebody else. But how many times do we talk about learning virtues from somebody else? How many times have you heard of someone who said, if you ever had the thought in your mind, oh, well, that person's really patient. Let me go live with them for a month and figure out how to be as patient as they are. You know, it sounds strange and that sounds silly, but he was deadly serious and it produced fruit. So he's going all to these first monks and he's taking what's good he sees in all of them and he's kind of synthesizing it in himself. So he's going to be free from anger. He's going to sleep on the ground and do long vigils to God at night. He's going to show love. He's going to show charity. He's going to take everything that's good and sort of synthesize it in himself. It's really remarkable. And that's what I try to emphasize. You know, the life of following Christ, it's about acquisition of the virtues. It's about truly doing good and being good to the sort of superlative degree. And so that was remarkable in and of itself. But of course, wherever you see the ellipsis, the ... that's where I cut some stuff out. So I cut out a few paragraphs, unfortunately, because it's all good. But okay. But the devil, who hates and envies what is good, could not endure to see such a resolution in a youth, but endeavored to carry out against him what he had been wont to effect against others. First of all, he tried to lead him away from the discipline, whispering him to the remembrance of his wealth, care of his sister, claims of kindred, love of money, love of glory, the various pleasures of the table, and the other relaxations of life. And at the last, the difficulty of virtue and the labor of it. So now the devil's trying to attack him in his thoughts. He's saying, you know, oh, you have to care for your sister. Oh, wouldn't it be nice to have money again? Oh, it's so hard to develop virtue, you know, wouldn't it be easier just to give up? He suggested also the infirmity of the body and the length of the time. So he said, you know, you have to work so hard, you know, you're going to get yourself sick, you're going to get hurt. In a word, he raised in his mind a great dust of debate, wishing to debar him from his settled purpose. When the enemy saw himself too weak for Anthony's determination, and that he rather was conquered by the other's firmness, overthrown by his great faith in falling through his constant prayers, then at length putting his trust in the weapons which are in the navel of his belly, and boasting in them, for they're his first snare for the young. So when navel of his belly, he's talking about sexual temptation, and boasting in them, for they are the first snare for the young, he attacked a young man, disturbing him by night and harassing him by day, so that even the onlookers saw the struggle which was going on between them. The one would suggest foul thoughts, and the other counter them with prayers. So it's talking about the back and forth between the devil and Anthony. So the devil would suggest foul thoughts, and Anthony would counter them with prayers. The one fire him with lust, the other, as one who seemed to blush, fortify his body with faith, prayers, and fasting. And the devil, unhappy wight, one night even took upon him the shape of a woman and imitated all her acts simply to beguile Anthony. But he, his mind filled with Christ, the nobility inspired by him, and considering the spirituality of the soul, quenched the coal of the other's deceit. So St. Anthony's life also becomes sort of a model of the ascetic life. So the first way the devil tempts us is through our thoughts or through other people. Don't expect anything supernatural. The first thing he tried to create doubts in St. Anthony. He tried to discourage St. Anthony, and then he tried to tempt him sexually. It was only after the thoughts and the other people failed that the devil started to manifest himself physically. So appearing as like a woman and trying to attract him. So keep this in mind as a general truth for spiritual life. Because sometimes as a priest, you know, especially with more excitable people, you know, it is not uncommon, but people come and say, oh, I think I have this or that spiritual disorder. I think, you know, maybe something demonic is happening to me or something. That's relatively common to get as a priest. And the truth is, you know, based on the experience of the saints, the devil's going to use whatever ordinary means he has first. He's going to get at you through your thoughts, or he's going to get at you through those people that really bother you or control you or irritate you. Don't expect anything supernatural until you've reached sort of a certain spiritual level. So just take that as a general rule. So So this is, but you can see, I mean, this is sort of outlining the spiritual warfare, and you can see how this is becoming a primitive guide sort of for monks. If anyone else wanted to take up this life, they could start to see, oh, here's maybe kind of a game plan. Because again, the first ones who did it were just doing it. They didn't have anything to guide them necessarily. So we skip, there's the ellipsis. So we skip some more. Wherefore, more and more he repressed the body and kept it in subjection. So the way to deal with certain things, especially lust, especially while you're young, is through physical discipline. The fathers say, if you want to control your lust, start with the stomach. That's you don't attack it directly, but the more you restrain yourself with fasting, the more willpower you have in that other area of your life. So, wherefore, more and more he repressed the body and kept it in subjection. And this is, by the way, the ideal of Orthodox asceticism, is that the mind has control over the body. The body doesn't call the shot, the mind does. Most of us live upside down. We do everything our bodies tell us. But the true disciplined spiritual warrior is trying to tell the mind tell the body what to do. Lest happily having conquered on one side, he should be dragged down on the other. He therefore planned to accustom himself to a severer mode of life, and many marveled, but he himself used to bear the labor easily. For the eagerness of soul, through the length of time it had abode in him, had wrought a good habit in him, so that taking but little initiation from others, he showed great zeal in this matter. He kept vigil, that means staying up. Keeping vigil means staying up in prayers. He kept vigil to such an extent that he often continued the whole night without sleep, and this not once, but often, to the marvel of others. He ate once a day after sunset, sometimes once in 2 days, and often even in 4. His food was bread and salt, his drink water only. Of flesh, that means meat, and wine, it is superfluous even to speak, since no such thing was found with the other earnest men. A rush mat served him to sleep upon, so this bed of reeds, basically, woven reeds. But for the most part, he lay upon the bare ground. He would not anoint himself with oil, saying it behooved young men to be earnest in training, and not to seek what would enervate the body. But they may accustom it to labor, mindful of the apostles' words, for when I am weak, then I am strong. For said he, the fiber of the soul is then sound when the pleasures of the body are diminished. And so that's a theme that comes up. It's in Orthodox spiritual practice, not as an absolute, but just in general. The more disciplined the body is, the more powerful the soul becomes. And the more restrained the body is, the more powerful the soul manifests itself. And he had come to this truly wonderful conclusion that progress in virtue and retirement from the world for the sake of it ought not to be measured by time, but desire and fixity of purpose. So just giving a glimpse at the difficult life he lived, this discipline. And he's having interaction. When it talks about him interacting with others, we're talking about these other sort of proto-monks. Again, monasticism isn't a formal institution, but there are these people living in the wilderness by themselves, and they're interacting with each other and learning and praying together and developing this sort of way of life. Thus tightening his hold upon himself. So this is Anthony's big one of the things Anthony's most known for. Thus tightening his hold upon himself, Anthony departed to the tombs, which happened to be at a distance from the village. So where the people lived in a cave with dead bodies. Not where people live. This is a cave, where they buried people. Again, this is also a place where demons were thought to live, including based on the gospel. So again, you read this as warfare. He's fighting with the devil. The devil suggests thoughts. He counteracts it with prayers. The devil tries to appear to him. He defeats the devil. And there's more direct interactions he has with the devil that I sort of cut out. But this is warfare against the devil. So now he's taking even further into the devil's turf, because the tombs are the place where the devil is believed to live. Thus, tightening holds upon himself, Anthony departed to the tombs, which happened to be at a distance from the village. And having bid one of his acquaintances to bring him bread at the interval of many days, he entered one of the tombs, and the other, having shut the door on him, remained within alone. And when the enemy could not endure it, so he's in there and he's praying, basically, but was even fearful that in a short time Anthony would fill the desert with the discipline. That's the term for proto-monasticism. They just called it the discipline. Coming one night with a multitude of demons, he so cut him with stripes that he lay on the ground speechless from the excessive pain. So there's these stages, right? First, the devil attacks us through thoughts or through other people. Then, if he has no power with that, he manifests himself. Then, if he has no power with that, he has a sort of right not to kill us, but to do a certain amount of damage to us physically. And that's even experienced by some ascetics in the modern day. I'll read about St. Joseph the Hesychast later. So he gets literally physically beaten by the demons. I mean, if these persuasions or terrors of the devil, physical pain might be a way to persuade Anthony to leave the desert. For he affirmed that the torture had been so excessive that no blows inflicted by man could ever cause him such torment. So this is a martyrdom, except he's not being martyred by men, he's being martyred by the devil. But this is the same way of life of the early Christians. But by the providence of God, for the Lord never overlooks that hope in him, the next day his acquaintance came bringing him the loaves. And having opened the door and seeing him lying on the ground as though dead, he lifted him up and carried him to the church in the village and laid him upon the ground. And many of his kinsfolk and the villagers sat around Anthony as round a corpse. But around midnight he came to himself and rose, and when he saw them all asleep, and his comrade alone watching, he motioned with his head for them to approach, and he asked him to carry him again to the tombs without waking anybody. So that is, I mean, amazing. So he's beaten to the point of death. He can't lift himself. He says, "Drag me back. I want to go around too." You can see the heroism. You can see what inspired young people. Young people by nature, so filled with fire in their chest, they want something, a way of life like that. And he's a living example of it. He was carried therefore by the man, and as he was wont, when the door was shut, he was within alone, and he could not stand up on account of the blows, but prayed as he lay. And after he had prayed, he said with a shout, "Here am I, Anthony. I flee not from your stripes, for even if you inflict more, nothing shall separate me from the love of Christ." And that boldness, wow. And then he sang, "Though it can't be said against me, my heart shall not be afraid." These were the thoughts and words of this ascetic. But the enemy who hates good, marveling that after the blows he dared to return, called together his hounds and burst forth. "You see," said he, "that neither by the spirit of lust nor by blows did we stay the man, but that he braves us, let him attack him in another fashion. But changes of form for evil are easy for the devil. So in the night they made such a din that the whole of the place seemed to be shaken by an earthquake. And the demons, as if breaking the four walls of the dwelling, seemed to enter through them, coming in the likeness of beasts and creeping things. And the place was on a sudden filled with the forms of lions, bears, bulls, serpents, asps, scorpions, and wolves, and each of them was moving according to his nature." So the devil's just trying to get rid of him through sheer terror at this point, to the illusions of, wild beasts coming to attack him. And again, this is something you see in modern Orthodox spiritual literature as well. The devil, will make sounds or make it sound like a robber's bursting into your house or something while you're praying or something, the Jesus prayer, to sort of distract you. The lion was roaring, wishing to attack, the bull seeming to toss with its horns, the serpent writhing but unable to approach, and the wolf as it rushed on was restrained. Then felt bodily pains severer still. He lay watching, however, with unshaken soul, groaning from bodily anguish, but his mind was altogether. The noises of the apparitions with their angry ragging were dreadful. But Anthony, stricken and goaded by clear, as in mockery, he said, "If there had been any power in you, it would have sufficed had one of you come. But since the Lord hath made you weak, you attempt to terrify me by numbers. And a proof of your weakness is that you take the shapes of brute beasts." So that's a thing that in general, a demon can maybe trick a person into killing themselves or persuade someone to kill themselves, but the devil can't actually take your life. He can just terrify you and in some cases hurt you somewhat. And again, with boldness he said, "If you are able and have received power against me, delay not to attack. But if you are unable, why trouble me in vain? For faith in the Lord is a seal and a wall of safety to us." So after many attempts, they gnashed their teeth upon him, because they were mocking themselves rather than him. Nor was the Lord then forgetful of Anthony's wrestling, but was at hand to help him. So looking up, he saw the roof as it were open, and a ray of light descending to him. The demon suddenly vanished, and the pain of his body straightway ceased, and the building was again whole. But Anthony, feeling the help and getting his breath again, being freed from pain, besought the vision which had appeared him, saying, "Where wert thou? Why didst thou not appear at the beginning to make my pain cease?" And a voice came to him, "Anthony, I was here, but I waited to see thy fight. Wherefore, since thou hast endured and hast not been worsted, I will even be a succor unto thee, and will make thy name known everywhere." Having heard this, Anthony arose in praise and received such strength that he perceived that he had more power in his body than formerly. And he was then about 35 years old. So this is the fruit of the labor. Like I said, it's not just about the negative stuff, but they go through the difficulty or that encounter with Christ. This is what we in Orthodox spirituality would call illumination, when God starts to reveal himself, starts to manifest himself. It's just, you can see how powerful the spiritual witness is, saying, where were you? Why did you not appear at the beginning? Where were you when the devil was attacking me and tempting me? And I think that's something we Christians can relate to a lot. Experiencing things like that in our life. Well, where was God when all this difficult stuff happened? So this experience of Anthony also, eases some of our existential issues as well, and reveals more about the character of God and his relation to us. So after this was like Anthony's big trial, his experience in the tombs. And after this, he gets this great grace from God, and he starts to develop, this miracle working that we characterize him later in the clear sight, where he can, see things very far away and in the future. And he starts to take on disciples. So it was this final trial in the tombs. And then, of course, there's the whole rest of his life and the Arian controversy and stuff. But I'm just trying to show you, sort of what inspired people about Anthony, because he took the Christian world by storm. And in fact, even St. Augustine, if any of you know the Confessions of St. Augustine, I'd really recommend them. Really fantastic. Christian spiritual diary. It's the first autobiography ever written. Or St. Augustine's just writing down his life. And actually, what was interesting, I didn't realize this till I read the Confessions myself, but St. Augustine, he's got this long period of his life where he's half in, he's half out. He's like half convinced of Christianity, but he doesn't want to give up his sins. He has this famous prayer like, Lord, give me chastity, temperance, humility, but not yet. And it was reading the life of Anthony, actually, that St. Augustine suddenly really becomes ashamed of himself and his wavering, and he has this powerful then spiritual experience where he hears a child's voice say, Tolle lege, go and read, and he opens the Bible and becomes inspired. And anyway, he devotes his life to Christ. And it was I didn't realize it was after reading the life of Anthony that he started this trajectory of his life. So Anthony made all these other saints. And of course, Augustine is living in Italy at this time. So it's showing you how quickly it's traveling within one generation, because they were almost contemporaneous. And Anthony, the life of Anthony made it, like I said, to France, to North Africa, all over. He was a rock star, and especially because there was this element of living witness to it. That Saint Athanasius, who's writing all this, was his disciple, lived with him, and caught a glimpse of some of these things and some of the passages. So first of all, I recommend reading the life of Anthony. It is great. It is inspiring, and it kind of gives you a template for later what happens. And so, okay, that's the life of Anthony. So we got to the year, early 300s from year zero. But I hope it was edifying for you guys, and I know I always enjoy it very much. I'm going to cut the recording here, but I'm going to hang out if anyone else needs anything else. Christ our God, you are the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. You have completed the divine plan of the Father. Fill our hearts with joy and gladness, now and ever, into the ages of ages. Amen. Okay, God bless you. All right.